Imagine a world bereft of the beloved poop emoji. Such a horrible timeline may have existed, if not for the influential work of renowned artist and storyteller Akira Toriyama. Toriyama began his career in the 70s as an artist in the advertising industry, but eventually quit his job when he realized that the 9-to-5 office life wasn't for him. Toriyama wanted to draw manga, and although he struggled for years as his submissions were rejected by manga magazines like Weekly Shonen Jump, he eventually met editor Kazuhiko Torishima, and they collaborated to refine Toriyama's work, resulting in Toriyama's first successful creation, Dr. Slump. This manga about a little robot girl named Arale who likes to run fast and poke poop became a smash hit, leading to an anime series and several video games in the heady days of 8-bit computers and consoles. The first developer to have Dr. Slump games on the market was a firm called Poppy Electronics, also known as Animest, which was a toy company formed by Bandai that released a series of LCD handhelds based on various popular animated series. Dr. Slump alone received a grand total of 6 handheld LCD games, most of which were clones of the popular Game & Watch games from Nintendo, and some of the later releases were even clones of previous Dr. Slump LCD games, with the form factor and art switched around to repackage the games and sell them again. Gameplay in the LCD games was naturally limited, focused on characters like Arale, her creator Senbei, and the mysterious alien baby Gachan, requiring the player to control these characters as they avoid attacks or shoot at their attackers, and all to rack up points in an endless loop. It's the classic Game & Watch model featuring characters that Japanese kids loved. Dr. Slump Mania extended to the world of games on an actual TV screen, and the first video game to release was once again a Bandai production. Titled Dr. Slump and Arale-chan, Bandai released the game for their Bandai Arcadia dedicated console, which was a localized Japanese version of the Emerson Arcadia 2001, that received 4 Japanese exclusives, such as his first crude attempt at adapting Dr. Slump. Evoking the garish colors and blocky graphics of the Atari 2600, the game assigns the player the role of Arale in an endless war of attrition, against the aliens King Nico-chan and his sarcastic yet faithful lackey. The player must yell at the aliens to prevent them from stealing parts to build their spaceship, while also stopping to refuel before Arale's energy depletes and the player loses a life. Bandai's reign of licensed exclusivity came to an end when Enix took over publishing duties for the next 2 titles, starting with Dr. Slump Bubble Blitz in 1984. This exclusive for the NEC 6001 and 6601 computer line was developed by a programmer named Kei Okamoto, and has the player controlling little Gachan as he jumps on bubbles created by Arale, collecting candy and trying to unlock the flying ability that the character always has in the original series. It wouldn't be an early video game without arbitrary limits placed on characters that have no such limits in their original forms. The game also features a noteworthy inclusion of multiple stages for the player to explore, with each stage increasing the challenge and changing the background art accordingly. The next game takes us to the end of Dr. Slump in the 80s, both as the final video game release of the decade, but also coinciding with the end of the manga and the anime. Titled Dr. Slump Run Senbei, Enix released the game in 1985 and worked with a developer named Takashi Goto to bring the game to the Sharp X1 line of computers. Marking a significant leap in graphic fidelity, Dr. Slump Run Senbei places the player in the role of Senbei for his one starring role in a video game, with the gameplay taking on the form of an endless runner. The player must help Senbei to dodge obstacles such as falling poop, while shooting some annoying crows and jumping over obstacles in the path. Dr. Slump briefly returned as a sequel manga series in the early 90s, but the marketing push for new merchandise didn't arrive until the reboot of the Dr. Slump anime in the late 90s. This redesigned and more energetic take on Dr. Slump retold the stories from the previous decade, with a more modern 90s attitude. And with the new show premiering, Bandai came back aboard in 1999 for a new video game on the Sony PlayStation console. This hybrid of adventure game and action platformer sees Arale roaming around and helping the various residents, while also fighting off the antics of villains such as Mashirito and large creatures that stand in the way of Arale completing her tasks. With a wide-ranging set of stories based on nearly 2 decades of the manga, this is perhaps the definitive video game adaptation of Dr. Slump, combining fun gameplay and clever writing that any Dr. Slump reader would expect. And like every video game on this list, it only released in Japan, but the fantastic Hilltop Translation Group took it upon themselves to localize the game for English-speaking players around the world. Nostalgia for the original Dr. Slump finally took hold by the end of the 2000s, and the newly formed Bandai Namco studio collaborated with developer Bitstep to release an interpretation of Dr. Slump for the Nintendo DS handheld. While featuring the familiar character designs from the 80s anime, the developers dove deep into the gimmick pool when designing the gameplay, requiring players to furiously swipe at the screen just to get Arale to run around in the environment. As with the previous game, the player must control Arale and help the residents of Penguin Village with various missions and tasks. The game showed promise, but the learning curve for the controls was simply too confusing, relegating the game to another example of developers thinking too much about how to incorporate the unique gimmick of the hardware into their game. Like many franchises, Dr. Slump lived on in video game form thanks to the growth of the mobile game market, and the series returned in 2014 with Dr. Slump Defense on iOS and Android. Created by Route 93 Incorporated and Creative Mobile Games, this Plants vs. Zombies clone features the player controlling an army of Penguin Village residents and fighting off classic villains from the series. The player begins with Arale and unlocks more character units over time, eventually piling on an absurd array of characters with various attacks and abilities, striving to cross the map and conquer each stage before moving on to the next. But as with all mobile freemium games, advancement is painfully slow unless the player chooses to pay money to speed things along. Players can still find this game online, and it even includes an English translation. Which brings us to the final game based on Dr. Slump, Arale Adventure from 2018. Made by a studio called Proficient City Games, the game appears to no longer function, requiring a connection to servers that have long since been decommissioned, leaving us to speculate on what the game is like based on footage and screenshots. What is clear is that the game plays much like a clone of the ballistic shooter game Worms, with the player recruiting Penguin Village residents to carry out attacks against myriad enemies from the Dr. Slump series.
这个就应该是36。Oh, perfect!
Dr. Slump may have ended in the 80s, as Toriyama became a global superstar known more for Dragon Ball and Dragon Quest, but Toriyama and the Dr. Slump team continued to celebrate Arale's place in the Toriyama canon throughout the decades, both by including her as a guest character at various points in the Dragon Ball series, and also including her as a character in many of the Dragon Ball video games. After the recent passing of Akira Toriyama, we may yet see a new big game featuring Arale and the gang, as the Japanese millennials who grew up with Dr. Slump gain enough power and influence to help bring back their nostalgic fave to modern platforms.